Hello, this is Mr. O'Brien, and this is a video of pages 3 through 6 in the Dr. Toer's Amazing Magic Lantern Show Viewer's Guide. The Second American Revolution. The Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history, did not begin as a war to end slavery. The North went to war in 1861 only to limit slavery's expansion and preserve the Union. Remember, it became a war to end slavery after Gettysburg. Well, after the Emancipation Proclamation and Gettysburg. Northerners wanted to keep slavery out of the West to reserve new land for the use of free white farmers and the free labor system. Remember, that was called the free labor ideology, that white farmers were not against slavery for moral reasons, but they were more against it because they could not compete with a system of slave labor. They couldn't compete with large farmers that were able to afford to get slaves. So they felt if a new territory allowed slavery, it would preclude them from moving out to that territory. All right. Where was I? I lost my spot. Here we are, second paragraph, third line. But Northern attempts to limit slavery led Southern states to secede from the Union. Soon the nation was at war. Nevertheless, the war opened new roads to freedom. As early as mid-1861, slaves began running away from plantations to find the Union Army. Remember, 1 million overall. While some Union officers returned runaways to their masters, others, like Benjamin Butler, declared them free and requested permission to use them as soldiers and laborers. In 1862, Congress responded with laws forbidding the Army to return runaways. Finally, in January 1863, President Lincoln enacted the Emancipation Proclamation, which officially gave the war a revolutionary purpose, the destruction of slavery. The proclamation cut off the Confederacy from possible allies, such as Great Britain. Right, so all throughout the first half of the Civil War, before the proclamation, the South was attempting to be recognized by other countries, most notably Britain, France. All right. But one of the reasons Lincoln issued the proclamation, or one of the benefits he saw in issuing the proclamation, was it would even further associate the South as a slave country, and it precluded nations such as Great Britain and France from recognizing them. All right, they themselves did not want to associate with a slave country, which the South would have been. Continuing, it also struck at the economic system of the South, took away their labor force. After the proclamation, more slaves dropped their tools and fled to the Union lines. The runaways helped cripple the cotton economy and weaken the Confederate war effort. As the Confederates weakened, the Union war effort grew stronger. Hundreds of thousands of ex-slaves built fortifications, manned supply lines, staffed hospitals, and worked as cooks and laundresses in Union Army camps. Soon black regiments were formed, and black men marched into battle against their former owners. That, again, is what you would call agency, being a part of your own story of freedom. All right, next page, page 4. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So the most well-known black regiments were formed by Northern free blacks. But 80% of black soldiers were, like Dr. Toer's Noah Brave, former slaves. All right, so Noah Brave is the character in the film. Remember, he's a former slave that became a soldier. Despite racial discrimination in the Union Army, black troops fought fiercely in battles from Virginia to Louisiana. Other ex-slaves, including former Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, served as scouts and spies, locating Confederate forces and guiding Union troops through unfamiliar territory. By working for and serving in the Union Army and Navy, black men and women helped win the war and defeat the slave owners. Again, agency. Yet at the war's end, many questions remained to be answered. Northerners debated how to rebuild a loyal, prosperous nation. Southern whites asked, "Who will we get to work our fields?" And the 4 million freedmen and women asked, "Will we now be free to live and raise families independent of white control?" Such concerns affected how Americans answered a fundamental question: what should freedom and equality for black Americans really mean? As different groups, North and South, black and white, put forward their answers to this question, Reconstruction began to take shape. In other words, there were different stakeholders in this. All right, the 4 million freed slaves wanted something. The millions of Southern whites wanted something else, and they were not the same thing. Radical Republicans wanted a more racially equitable South. Moderate Republicans wanted to go back to the status quo, business as usual before the Civil War. All right, yeah, the slaves could be free, but hey, we want our cotton. All right, so there were a bunch of different stakeholders here. All right, all right, going on to page 5, winning the war, losing the peace. And by that, I mean the memory. By losing the peace, I mean losing the memory of what we remember about the Civil War and Reconstruction. So shortly after the war ended, President Lincoln was assassinated, and Vice President Andrew Johnson of Tennessee replaced him. Johnson had been loyal to the Union, but opposed full equality for African Americans. He pardoned the rich planters who had led the Confederacy and allowed them to retake positions of political power. Remember, all right, so Andrew Johnson was chosen as vice president because he was from a secessionist state, but refused to leave the Union. So it was kind of a conciliatory gesture on the part of Lincoln. Now, Andrew Johnson hated the elite, despised the rich white Southern elite, but was also really, really racist. He was very, very much in favor of the working class white man, free labor ideology. And Lincoln's plan, before he was assassinated, the 10% plan, was quite lenient on the South, remember. The southern states that left. They only had to get 10% of their citizens offer an oath to the Constitution to get back into the Union. They had to approve the 13th Amendment to get back into the Union, and that was a requirement until the amendment passes. But when Andrew Johnson took over, and I should say under Lincoln's plan, almost all Confederates were pardoned except for officers. But once Andrew Johnson enters office, he winds up pardoning almost every single Confederate. I mean, remember Stevens, the vice president, the Cornerstone speech? He goes on to high elected positions in government after that. So Andrew Johnson loathed the rich Southern white elite, but what he loved even more than his hate for them was if they came to him groveling. And he actually, and I'm not making this up, he told them, I'll pardon you guys, but you got to show up in the White House and ask me in person. And he just loved these rich people coming to him begging to be pardoned, and he pardoned them. All right. Um, so next paragraph. Ex-Confederate planters, known to the emancipated slaves as buckras, which is a word you'll hear in the video, uh, ex-Confederate planters wanted to narrow the meaning of equality. They wanted to recreate the conditions of slavery. They used state governments to try to push African Americans back towards slavery. And this is during what's called presidential Reconstruction, the years Andrew Johnson ran it from 1865 to 1867. So basically in those years, the southern states were free to, the southern white controlled states were free to do whatever they wanted under Andrew Johnson along racial lines. In late 1865 and 66, southern states passed laws called black codes, kind of like precursors to Jim Crow laws, making it hard for African Americans to obtain land and forcing most to sign year-long contracts to work for whites. And these contracts would tether African Americans to the plantations, um, and it would have rules that would approximate the conditions of slavery. Uh, it didn't get all the way there. There were still freedoms that didn't exist, plenty of freedoms before the Civil War. Nevertheless, the intent was to tether African Americans to their white overseers. African Americans during these years could not vote, they couldn't testify in court, and if they were insolent to whites, improper in public, they could be put in jail, arrested on charges of vagrancy or things like that. All right, remember the 13th Amendment allows slavery if you are in prison. So you also saw a major uptick in the arrest of African Americans, which hasn't stopped. We have 5% of the world's population right now, and 25% of its prison population. And the majority and African Americans are tremendously disproportionately represented in those who are behind bars. Um, Next paragraph. This didn't agree with ex-slaves' idea of freedom and equality, so they wanted something totally different. Across the South, they held protest meetings. They called on the federal government to abolish the black codes and grant black men the right to vote. African Americans in Mississippi wrote to Congress, as we have, quote, as we have fought in favor of liberty, justice, and humanity, we wish to vote in favor of it, close quote. So, again, this is during presidential Reconstruction. The Black Codes also outraged many Northern Republicans, even those who thought equality meant only equal treatment before the law. So what I'm saying here is just the Black Codes. Moderate Republicans didn't really want to. They weren't all that eager to do more than just free the slaves, but those Black Codes really appalled them. All right. So, led by the radical Republicans, Congress passed laws and amendments to overthrow the Black Codes and to weaken the big planters' Democratic Party. Congress also sent Union troops and agents to the Freedmen's Bureau to the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress after the Civil War to help the 4 million freed people become free, to adjust to freedom, and to protect them as much as possible down south from the white response, which was rage. Now, to be sure, the Freedmen's Bureau was fighting a losing battle from day one. They were too tiny and they were too severely underfunded. What generally would happen is the radical Republicans would propose a law or some type of government act that would help African Americans down south. And I don't know if you're aware, maybe you are, you took civics, I believe, but whenever a law is proposed in Congress, it then goes to the committees throughout Congress. It has to get voted on by those individual committees before it goes back to Congress as a whole. And what would happen is it would get watered down by the moderate Republicans. So the Freedmen's Agency, the Freedmen's Bureau would be a radical Republican's idea, but it would, the funding for it and its powers would be weakened in the committees by the moderate Republicans, who, like I said, were not all that eager to do much more than just free the slaves. When President Johnson opposed these moves, the radicals tried to force him from office. So a couple of things in that image here, you see a rich white Southerner showing up in Johnson's office looking for a pardon, which he got. All right, if you go to the next page, the politics of equality. This is page 6, the last page I'm going to read in this video. So if page 5 was presidential Reconstruction, page 6 would be congressional Reconstruction. So in 1867, Congress impeached the president. It was the first president to be impeached. Basically, they impeached him. I think it was like 11 or 12 articles of impeachment they sent over. So the House, remember, you should know this, right? It didn't happen all that long ago. The House investigates. The House then sends articles of if they find enough evidence. It's the equivalent of being indicted by your local courts, right? So if you're impeached, the House sends articles of impeachment to the Senate, and the Senate then conducts the trial. Okay, so Andrew Johnson kept vetoing all these civil rights acts and laws and so on and so forth by Congress. So they impeached him, basically for abuse of power. All right, and it was an election year in which they impeached him, 1867. Okay, an election year. All right, so this page is congressional Reconstruction, and they actually wound up finding him not guilty by one vote. And that one vote was Andrew Johnson's drinking buddy that found him not guilty. But others agreed to vote not guilty. When Andrew Johnson agreed to kind of get out of the way and just rubber stamp everything they did. So here we go. Congress watched over Reconstruction from 1867 until the early 1870s, congressional Reconstruction. And that's when things began to change and get better for African Americans temporarily. With white, and again, these these years were, Congress spent trying to overturn the black codes, trying to give African Americans the right to vote, right to hold office, so on and so forth. So, with white planters' power restricted, freed men and women could try out their own ideas about the meaning of freedom and equality. Politics is one of the most important arenas for such activity. Freed slaves eagerly organized local political clubs and events such as picnics and parades. When black men won the right to vote, they voted in large numbers for the party that had supported emancipation, the Republican Party. Remember that. It's a question, I believe, on your test. African Americans voted Republican. They didn't begin to change until 1932, FDR. Next paragraph. Black Republicans worked with Northerners who had moved south, including former Freedmen's Bureau agents and those who had come to set up shops and farms. Some Southern whites also joined the Republican Party. Most were poor farmers from the hills, hoping to protect the independent way of life of the upcountry. At the top of the Southern Republican Party sat a few white businessmen interested in attracting investors and encouraging new industrial development. All right, so there were some poorer whites who allied themselves with the freed people, but for the most part, race got in the way. So historians sometimes, or I should say more than sometimes, often lament this opportunity, right? The very large amount of middle to poor white Southerners could have allied themselves with the 4 million freed people and really just overturned the whole elite-controlled, state assemblies and governors' offices, governors' mansions in the South. But they didn't. Race got in the way, at least in white people's minds. So black voters elected hundreds of black officials to positions in local, state, and even national government. Again, this is during congressional Reconstruction. To be sure, the only state in which the state assembly was majority African American during these years was South Carolina, which is the next sentence. Though never a majority in any state legislature except South Carolina's, black representatives helped construct modern constitutions for southern states. So once they would re-enter the Union, these states had to rewrite their constitutions. They passed laws to help poor people, and these egalitarian, more people-friendly laws, not elite-friendly laws. So during these years, they passed laws to help poor people, black and white, and they taxed rich planters to fund the South's first public schools and hospitals. As judges, sheriffs, and jury members, they tried to protect black communities from white power and violence. So that's pages 3 through 6.